Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexander Aldarondo Jiménez, and I am the founder and director of Amorir, the first end-of-life doula organization in Puerto Rico. I will skip uh, personal presentations and introductions about Amorir because I believe the presentation itself provides a pretty good idea of who we are and what we do. So I'm going to get right onto it and share my screen. This presentation is both a story and a call to action. It begins with Amorir's emergence as Puerto Rico's first end-of-life doula organization, born in a culture where death is surrounded by silence, confusion, and inherited fear. From there, we will explore what we've learned by holding space and listening deeply and collectively to what our people say about death, dying, and grief. We'll close by sharing a methodology for cultural transformation, how we're mapping the territory of death in our context, what it reveals, what it invites, and what we believe becomes possible when death is reimagined as something sacred, communal, and sovereign. We will also show how this work might serve others, wherever they are, to co create a culture of death shaped by dignity, presence, and collective remembering. So everybody knows where Puerto Rico is located. I have prepared a little visual to assist with that. A little flyover to Boriquen, the original name of this territory by the natives of this land. So, for those of you that might not know, Puerto Rico is a colonized territory of the United States. And before that, it was under Spanish colonial rule for over 500 years. Our people have lived under imposed systems that deny us of full self-determination, and in doing end-of-life work, we found that death became a magnifying glass, revealing how this denial shows up in our bodies, our families, institutions, and in our silence. In Puerto Rico, death is not just silence, it is stripped of spiritual agency, of legal clarity, and of cultural coherence. Grief is pathologized. Autonomy is obstructed by bureaucracy and religious dogma. The result is a population disempowered in its final threshold. Amorir emerged in direct response to this reality, not only to offer care at the bedside, but to reclaim the right to die with dignity, sovereignty, and belonging. In the video, you might have noticed some location pins that showed up. These are the locations where we have impacted and held community spaces over the last year as reference. Moving on. So who we are and why we started. We began basically asking ourselves, like, how do we serve a community silence around death? What is it that we're truly being called to do? Our service accompanying the dying inadvertently became directly related to a cultural revolution centered on living lives worth dying from. We began this work wanting to serve and accompany people at the end of life, but we asked ourselves, how are we going to get people to seek our services if they don't even know what an end of life doula is? If most people are terrified of talking about this topic? We started holding virtual and then in person spaces to talk about death, to assess people's sentiments and needs. People arrived carrying silence, shame, fear, and a deep hunger to speak, to be witnessed. We became a recurring space where people came together to talk about the elephant in the room. Just that in this case, it looked sort of like this. Through our workshops, we began questioning that silence, not just from protest, but from curious, compassionate inquiry, because something felt off about the way we handle death, dying, loss, and grief here. People arrived at these spaces wanting to sort of learn from experts, only to find that we were as clueless as they were. Our only advantage was that we had been in conversation about death a little bit longer, and that our trainings as end of life doulas gave us a framework, but no answers. We were as confused as anybody else looking into the abyss, trying to understand it. We were not there to teach, we were there to learn from them, from each other, from death itself. So, as the non experts that we knew we were, we designed community workshops that were participatory, emergent, exploratory, and playful, aimed at tapping into the collective wisdom of the group to find pieces of the puzzle. We crafted spaces to move beyond our personalities and analytical minds and into emotion, into the wisdom of our bodies, these very bodies in which we will all die. We sought to have embodied somatic experiences through which we could explore how it feels to sense the social field of a room, this palpable energy that emerges when strangers look at each other and at death straight in the eyes, when they open up and all their differences dissolve in the presence of their shared mortality. As one participant said at the end of a workshop, I've just realized that I'm part of the largest community in the world, that of people who are going to die. And that is so strangely relieving, he said. From these gatherings, we harvested ideas, themes, and questions. The puzzle pieces, the clues, they became the content, and we followed them. Some of the topics that emerged were, let's talk about death. Your life is urgent. What happens after death? We have no idea. Looking at life from the perspective of death, exploring the fear of death and dying and all of its myths, navigating loss and grief. Let's talk about suicide. It's more common than you think. What are advanced directives? These are some of the highlighted topics of the workshops and spaces that we held. Workshop after workshop, people walked out of these spaces laughing, hugging, feeling lighter, as if a huge weight had been lifted. They slowed down, turned off their minds, even for a little bit, and externalized unquestioned beliefs about life and death. Through these encounters, participants often realized, reaffirmed, how absurd and limiting those beliefs are, to the point that they could laugh at these beliefs as they lose their power over them out in the light. Almost surprised why they never questioned these notions, participants left more spacious in their minds and in their hearts, knowing that there are other ways to navigate death that invite curiosity, awe, and acceptance rather than fear, anxiety, and aversion. And we asked ourselves, what were people really responding to? Beneath the laughter, the movement, the tears, there was a longing to remember death not only as inevitable, but as natural, as human, as communal. This didn't come from theory or intellectual analysis. It came from presence, from silence, shared aloud. This work led us to a deeper realization. In Borinquen, silence has been a colonial tool of control. There are no public spaces to talk about death, let alone grief. Grief is pathologized, privatized, and professionalized. Death is thrown under the rug as something too uncomfortable to deal with. We began to see death work as decolonial practice. Our customs around death are not neutral, they are inherited from colonial frameworks. To transform them, we must evolve our culture. We must reclaim ancestral wisdom and locate our power, our sense of being, our knowledge in connection to the territory where we live, because this is the territory where we will eventually rest our bones. We must restore death back to community spaces. As we explored what constituted a good death, its values, its conditions, its felt experiences, we quickly realized the answers were inseparable from the way we do living, from what constitutes a good life. In Boriken, the ways we die are shaped by colonial systems that value fear over trust, fragmentation over wholeness, separation over connection, institutions over community, thinking over feeling, doing over being, etc., etc. And we found through this process that a good death feels deeply aligned to the values that we have forgotten. Amorir came to understand that a central part of this end of life work had to be providing scaffolding for the emergence of a new culture of death. That meant designing together new language, symbols, rituals, spaces, and practices in order to arrive at a more complete understanding of the what's and the how's. We had to listen, but not just with our minds, with our whole selves, to tune into full self felt experiences of our grief, our memories, our bodies. And from that integrated listening and understanding, a compass began to emerge, guiding us to the collective visions of the territory of dying that we had long been yearning for, perhaps unknowingly. This is a at least 400-year-old ceiba tree in Vieques, an island municipality to the east of the mainland of Puerto of Borique. Um, and I wanted to bring it here because the ceiba tree was regarded by many um, natives and as the tree of life, of a very sacred tree. And Vieques was at some point a military range and a navy base for the U.S. Navy. Um, and it has a long history of also being under the hard effects of colonial rule. So I wanted to honor it by bringing that Ceiba here and bringing Vieques to the presentation. To understand what we are working here with, we had to map it. To truly understand the work we had been called to do, we felt we had to have a deeper understanding of the nuances of the current social, cultural, and territorial context in which we were serving the dying, like acknowledging, studying, and readying ourselves for the water in which we will swim. As part of Amorir's first end-of-life training, we invited participants to co-create a cultural radiography of how death is lived in Puerto Rico. Inspired by Michael White's narrative practices, we called it Mapping the Territory of Death in Puerto Rico. Through visual and narrative practices, participants externalize the challenges, contradictions, and the inherited beliefs shaping death today. By seeing them laid bare with fresh eyes, we could begin a reauthoring process where we positioned ourselves separate from them and relating different to them, not as victims, but as co-creators from a place rooted in our preferred values. From this mapping process, two distinct landscapes emerged: the landscape of actions and the landscape of meanings. Landscape of actions is basically everything that we can see happening, concrete actions, what we do, what we allow, repeat, the practices around dying. And the landscape of meaning relates to our beliefs, concepts, values, ideas, feelings, and the narratives, the stories that we hold about death. As we began plotting all these points of information, four categories, as if four forces shaping death, emerged: the social, the cultural, the legal, and the medical. Also, I skipped to mention that some of the highlighted um, elements that came up in the landscape of actions and landscape of meanings were isolation, medicalization, bureaucratic control, and taboo, failure, religious fatalism, among others. These four categories emerged, and we were able to start grouping some of these points, these elements in the territory within these groups. I'm going to be sharing a couple unsurprising findings to highlight what we extracted from the exercise. In the category of social landscape of actions, we saw a lot of media sensationalism, that there's no pause to process grief. There's a lot of invisibility and isolation, that the elderly are invalidated, put aside, that we often ignore the spiritual dimensions of the process of dying. In the landscape of meanings, there are a lot of unquestioned stigmas, that there's no dignity in death, we're going to heaven or hell, that dying is dirty and ugly, that there's a lot of ignorance and confusion about the dying process. In the cultural category, landscape of actions, we avoid communication and closure. We avoid talks about death. We have some rituals, prayers, lighting candles, rosaries, visiting graves, all influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition imposed to us with colonization. Also, we do not touch the sick. We do not touch the dead. We avoid emotions related to death in public. In the landscape of meanings, some of the things that came up was strong fear and taboo towards death. The idea that talking about death attracts death, that all is relegated to God. God decides, so we don't prepare for dying. We saw that religiosity permeates and surrounds many aspects of death. The idea that grief must be let go of within a certain time period. This notion that dying is helpless and pitiful. Oh, poor thing. Bless his soul. Bless his soul. This idea that we go somewhere after death, that there's some sort of relocation. In the medical category, landscape of actions, we definitely ignore the spiritual dimension and the sacredness of the moment of death. There are a lot of medical procedures that are imposed without patients' informed consent. We demonize hospice care and palliative treatments. We isolate the sick and the dying. We over sanitize the dying process. We always call medical professionals for everything, even when unnecessary or counterproductive. The notions in the landscape of meanings, the notion that prolonging life is the best and most desirable thing, that death is relief from suffering, accepting palliative care is giving up and dying, the notion that the hospital is the safest place to die, and that we have to do what the doctors say, even when my entire self is telling me differently. In the legal category, we accept government regulations without question. Disputes emerge over inheritance matter even before a funeral has been celebrated. We don't create advance directives. Death-related laws are bureaucratized. These laws and rights and processes are not taught in any social institution. And most people find about these processes, duties, costs, requirements when death is already in their face. It already happened to a family member. Then in the landscape of meanings, the notion that preparing for death equals to creating a testament and paying funeral arrangements ahead of time. And that's as far as we go. The spiritual dimension of life is not recognized by law, and the respect for dignity of life and human rights are just fluff, boneless terms in the Constitution that don't translate to any real lived experiences for people. We could only get so far in this exercise. We know this snapshot of the territory of death was not going to be exhaustive, but that it would allow us to use it as reference and as a place to go back to continue building, externalizing and making visible what is today. Externalizing and making visible what is today allowed us to step back and to see connections and relationships, interactions between the different elements we plotted, between the two landscapes, between the four categories, and to begin to grasp how they inform and impact how we live our lives and the ways in which we will eventually die within this very territory. After looking, analyzing, and talking, we paused to feel it. We asked participants, what does dying in this territory feel like? The general picture was not pleasant. It didn't feel calm or sacred or dignified. It felt disconnected. It felt rushed. It felt institutional, just to mention a few. We went further. We took the time to invite participants to turn inward, to turn deeply inward and then backwards in time, to feel the grief of our slaughtered and raped ancestors as colonization arrived at their shores, to recognize that we are all the inheritance of the brutal extermination of the Boricuas, to let that truth sink in and inform our next most compassionate step forward into this work today. This is this image is of a ceremonial burial that was taken from the burial site and is now at a museum, just to show, to connect us to our ancestors in our land and to the way that we treat their bones, their sacred locations. They don't belong in museums. But moving on. What kind of future we long to create? We asked ourselves, from this state of openness, this contrast, a vision emerged, and it was clear, grounded, and already alive in our longings. It was hinting at us from the very beginning, as if leading us from the emerging future, as Otto Scharmer invites us through Theory U. We knew almost immediately how we wanted dying in Puerto Rico to feel like, and we jumped right back to work. But this time, mapping not the death we inherited, but the death we want to die. As we got to work, the landscapes of meaning and actions bloomed into the territory organically. A collectively imagined future emerged, a deaf culture centered in dignity, presence, community, autonomy, and spiritual diversity. A Puerto Rico where grief is shared, death is not a taboo, and the sacredness of dying is honored in all of its forms. The concepts, ideas, cultural memes, notions, symbols, rituals, practices, laws, etc., that we had to design, to use, to share, and to embody, to make part of our own culture as end of life doulas became poignantly clear. Our training was also inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy. One principle in particular influenced and guided this exercise deeply. The large is a reflection of the small, and small is good. Small is all. It suggests that systemic change is achieved by focusing on and intentionally cultivating powerful small scale interactions and practices, drawing from patterns in nature like fractals, like mycelia. By practicing our desired values and principles at a micro level, we establish patterns that can scale up to influence entire systems, making small, deliberate actions the foundation for widespread transformative change. We knew this systemic change we were referring to as a cultural evolution. We knew it would have to begin with the smallest relational units, how we talk to ourselves inside our heads, how we talk at our dinner tables, in our WhatsApp chat groups, at the bar, in line at the supermarket, in the way we talk about, prepare for, and live our own deaths daily. All of it somehow had to be directly informed by our collective vision of the future. This is not utopia, it is a direction, it is a path already being walked by doulas, caregivers, and wide awake citizens calling for a new way of dying, and through that, a new way of living. That is what Amorir is here to support. Emergent strategy is a way that all of us can begin to see the world in life code, awakening us to the sacred systems of life all around us. The longing to remember death as a profoundly natural, human, and communal came first. Then came the mapping, and upon studying the territory of death, the realization, the clarity. Lastly, with that clear awareness came the responsibility for suspending the old codes in us and collaboratively designing, prototyping, and embodying the new. This is a picture of the first cohort of the Amorir's end of life doula training. We believe this process of naming, mapping, and dreaming death in community is not unique to Puerto Rico, of course. It's a practice that any territory, any people can begin. What would it look like for you? What might your community's deaf culture become if you held space to listen, to remember, and to reimagine together. I think we should get together next year and share the maps of our desired territories of death. Perhaps this can begin to inform our end of life doula trainings. What do you say? Thank you so much. Here is our information, our contact, if anybody wants to deepen this work together with us. Thank you for your time.